The last time I recorded a video breaking down our $500 fantasy football slow draft, the team ended up winning $20,000. Now, to be completely honest with you, a couple of those players that were on that year's team are actually bringing it back with A.J. Brown and Jaylen Hurts. But I want to take you round by round here, talk about exactly what we were thinking at each pick, our targets, our avoids, our strategy. And to be completely honest with you, we got extremely lucky in this draft, starting with our draft position, where we ended up getting pick 6. Now, if you go over to the website, you'll see that I actually have a tier of 6 players overall in our fantasy football rankings going into this next season, and you can order these guys whatever way you want. But I believe that Ja'Marr Chase, Saquon Barkley, Bijan, Jefferson, Lamb, and Jahmyr Gibbs all have their own reasons to potentially be the number 1 overall player in fantasy football. So when I'm selecting at pick number 6, what I'm doing is I'm going to let our league mates, I'm going to let our opponents determine who we start with in the first round. Now, 9 times out of 10, at least on underdog drafts I found, we are going to be coming away with Jahmyr Gibbs. And I have zero hesitation to take him here at this selection. Really, the only other guys you could consider, maybe Ashton Genty if you wanted a running back, maybe Puka Nacua, Malik Neighbors, Amon-Ra St. Brown if you wanted a wide receiver. But going over and looking at what Jahmyr Gibbs has been able to provide you through the first 2 years of his NFL career, he starts off as a rookie averaging 16.5 fantasy points per game. And this was good for the mark of RB6 as a rookie running back, splitting the backfield with David Montgomery. Now, jumping up to year 2, what's very interesting to note is Jahmyr Gibbs actually dramatically increased his role as a rusher, particularly with his carries inside the 5-yard line. Now, if you go look at the site, you can expand, obviously, the players in the rankings page to see all the advanced metrics that we have. This is completely free. And inside the 5-yard line, Jahmyr Gibbs averaged 0.7 carries per game in his rookie season. That jumps up to 1 carry a game inside the 5-yard line in year 2. He actually averages only 43% of the Detroit Lions running back carries in games he played in as a rookie, but that market share number went up to 48% in his second season. His juke rate somehow managed to improve from 24% to 27%. He averaged 5.6 yards per carry. So across the board, Jahmyr Gibbs was more involved as a rusher. He had more utilization at the goal line, and he was a more efficient back with this as well. Now, I will say that there is a slight drawback, and this is why I'm not going to have Jahmyr Gibbs ranked as the number 1 overall running back in fantasy this next year. What was very surprising for me, you actually did have more usage from David Montgomery as a receiver in 2024 in comparison to what we saw in 2023. Jahmyr Gibbs did fall from 4.7 targets per game down to 3.7, but he actually rose with his receiving yards per game from 21 to 30. So Jahmyr Gibbs averaged about 110 total yards per game last season behind an elite offensive line. And if we're looking at these two running backs, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be 23 years old this next season. Jahmyr Gibbs has been the more efficient back at the same time in Detroit. And if we go ahead and we look at David Montgomery, well, Montgomery's been great. At the same time, David Montgomery is going to be 28. If you're telling me that one of these running backs is going to see a step backwards with their overall usage, I would make a bet that it's Montgomery and not Gibbs. And if we look at this age 22 season for Jahmyr Gibbs and cross-reference it since the year 2000 for the 9 most similar seasons, you had Christian McCaffrey in 2018. What did McCaffrey do the following season? Oh, that's right. He averaged 29 fantasy points per game and broke fantasy football. We had LaShawn McCoy in 2010. What did LaShawn McCoy do the following season? Oh, he averaged 22 fantasy football points per game in 1 leagues. We had Kareem Hunt as a rookie. We had Ray Rice in 2009, Steve Slayton in 2008, Joe Mixon in 2018, James Robinson in 2020, and Saquon Barkley in 2019. Now, Barkley got injured the following season. And of course, I'm never going to be able to sit here and predict injuries. If Gibbs gets hurt, this team's in the gutter. However, if he stays healthy, the number 1 prize in this tournament this year is actually $200,000 in the big dog. Y'all know I won the big dog a couple years back for $100,000. We're hoping to double that this season with Gibbs, starting off at 1. Now, going to round 2, we get extremely lucky here as well. Now, to be completely honest with you, we get very lucky in a lot of points of this draft, and I think that this is an absolute monstrous squad. Now, back in the day when we won 2 tournaments for $100K and $20K, both teams had A.J. Brown on it, and one of those teams had Jaylen Hurts as well. A.J. Brown is a receiver that, yes, the volume's not going to be anything special. We're not going to see A.J. Brown come through and average 10 targets per game. To actually be exact, A.J. Brown's best season ever, he was at 9.3 targets per game in 2023 in Philadelphia. That fell down to 7.5 targets per game in 2024. But a big thing I want to focus in on is not that this was due to anything from A.J. Brown himself. This was due to the overall game script that you had in these Eagles games, where the Eagles were able to just run the ball over and over and over again in the second half. If you look at the site, A.J. Brown actually had 3.16 yards per route run. This was the best mark that we've seen since his rookie season. If you look at the site, A.J. Brown had a 34.5% team target share in the games that he played. The only other wide receiver to be able to do something like this was Malik Nabers, where Nabers is in New York in one of the worst offenses in the league and doesn't really have competition the way that A.J. Brown does with Devonta Smith. Now, if we go over and if we look at the Philadelphia Eagles this next season, it's actually going to be a much tougher schedule than what they saw in 2024. So while, yes, in 2024, almost every game they played in the second half of the year was a blowout, it was just bell to ass, the way Saquon Barkley said earlier last week. If we get some closer games for the Philadelphia Eagles and we see the passing volume rise for A.J. Brown, there's no reason to not believe that he can't get back to being a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy. And the worst season that we've ever had from him in Philadelphia, he was the wide receiver 13 from a points per game perspective. Now, going over and looking at Chase Brown, this is where things get very interesting. I've talked about this before, but you can see my rankings on the site. I have Chase Brown ranked at 20th overall. However, in these underdog drafts at the moment, Chase Brown's going to the middle of the end of the third round. Like, I would rather have Chase Brown ahead of like Josh Jacobs, Jonathan Taylor. I think I can make an argument to have him up there with like Bucky Irving and Derrick Henry, to be completely honest with you. At least that's how I have it in my rankings. Now, I may be missing something here. A full transparency. You go and look at the underdog pick'em that they have for Chase Brown in week 1 right now. They have the dude higher, lower, like 45.5 rushing yards, which I frankly don't understand, because you look at the breakout from Chase Brown in the second half of last season. Chase Brown comes through. He's the RB 4, 3, 8, 9, 5, 4, 22, and 13. So in those final 8 or so weeks, 7 of them, he finishes as the top 13 running back. And he does this with an incredible snap rate. Every single one of those weeks, he plays over 80% of the snaps for the Cincinnati Bengals. And of course, the Bengals, they were a threat to bring in a running back in the NFL draft. They brought in Caleb Johnson to try him out. I mean, there were a lot of running backs rumored to go to Cincinnati, and I thought Chase Brown could have potentially been nuked in the draft, but it didn't happen. Chase Brown is still in this same backfield. Yes, they bring in Taj Brooks, who I've been mixing in round 18 in some drafts, but it's not like he's going to be anything. So I view Chase Brown as a running back with a 3-down role that's going to be used as a receiver in one of the best offenses in the league. So I'm trying to make him one of my most drafted players in general. The fact that we get him at pick 30 here, I absolutely love. The running backs that go directly after him are Breece Hall, Kyron Williams, and Amari Hampton. Now, going over to our next round, we're going to take Xavier Worthy. So we have 2 running backs and 1 wide receiver through the first 3. And one thing that's going to be different about drafting on Underdog in comparison to your ESPN draft, in comparison to your Yahoo draft, is in your ESPN, in your Yahoo leagues, where you only start 2 wide receivers, 1 flex, where you have access to the waiver wire, you're going to be able to find wide receiver values late. In these underdog drafts, if y'all are seeing my live streams every single night, you'll notice like the wide receiver position is going to dry up very, very quick. Wait till we get to round 10 in this video. So if you fall behind at the wide receiver position, you have to begin catching up ASAP. And that's what this Xavier Worthy selection is. Worthy is one of my most drafted receivers on Underdog, because keep in mind, these are also tournaments where we are chasing the highest ceiling possible for weeks 15, 16, 17. And I think Xavier Worthy has just that. Worthy was a 21-year-old rookie wide receiver last season that comes through, averages almost 12 fantasy points per game, averages about 40 receiving yards per contest, not to include what he was able to do as a rusher. So if we check off the fact that he was an impressive rookie, he was a round 1 NFL draft pick at an incredibly young age, attached to Patrick Mahomes, I think that this screams year 2 breakout, absolute smash in the 4th round. If you look historically, age 21 wide receiver seasons that were comparable to Xavier Worthy, you have Josh Gordon. I'd be very happy if he puts out the 22.5 points per game Josh Gordon did at 22 years old. You had Jackson Smith-Njigba. JSN obviously takes that step forward to 15.2 fantasy points per game the following season. You had Percy Harvin, who took a step forward up to 14.5. You had DeAndre Hopkins, who took a step forward up to 14.5. You had Jordan Addison, who took a step forward up to 14.5. You had Jerry Jeudy, you had Elijah Moore, and you had Antonio Bryant. So really the only disappointing player that got worse from a rookie to his second year perspective is going to be Elijah Moore on this list. And you actually have Worthy attached to a much better quarterback than Elijah Moore was. Worthy does have the NFL round 1 draft capital that Elijah Moore didn't. So I'm completely fine with Worthy. And also you do have the added bonus that maybe Kelsey gets hit with the fall off. If Kelsey doesn't fall off, then you do have the out of maybe Rashee Rice gets suspended or maybe Rice is injured. Now going over and looking at our 5th round selection, this is another one of these picks. I want to be stupid simple, stupid boring. I talk about stacking a lot, and I want to reiterate, stacking's very important in underdog tournaments, but it's very important in your regular fantasy football league as well. Like, a lot of people get this confused thinking that stacking doesn't make sense outside of anything but best ball. But when we're stacking, we are making a consolidated bet. When I took A.J. Brown in round 2, what I said is, if he's going to be a top 5 wide receiver and I'm going to have the ability to win this league, what probably needs to happen is the Philadelphia Eagles probably need to throw the ball a little bit more than they did last season. So if I'm already betting on that happening, why don't I double down? Well, yes, it's going to lower my floor. It's going to raise my ceiling as well. So we go ahead, we take Jaylen Hurts. I'm going to be very, very clear with Jaylen Hurts. He is an elite quarterback. Since he has taken over as a starter in Philadelphia, we have yet to see a single season with fewer than 20 fantasy points per game. That type of consistency you can't find from anybody not named Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen. So to get Hurts at 54, to pair it with A.J. Brown, I'm all about it. Now, our next selection's a lot tougher. It's not as easy. It is something that you kind of had to go back and forth with. But I decided to take Chris Godwin at pick 67. Now, a big mistake that I've made with these underdog teams in the past is I've decided to maybe go a little bit too hard drafting the injured players in May and June. Like, you go back last season, I was mixing in Nick Chubb. I was taking Jonathan Brooks. I was taking TJ Hawkinson. Every single selection, an absolute disaster class. Like, laughably bad from start to finish. None of those picks made sense. And I was the idiot who fell for it, thinking that their rehab was going to go great, thinking that they could make a difference in 2024. I'm very much afraid that same thing's going to happen with Chris Godwin. Now, I've Godwin ranked as the wide receiver 32 myself. Here we get Chris Godwin right after guys like Jerry Jeudy, Chris Olave, Rome Odunze, Jordan Addison, Juwan Jennings. So I want to be very clear. We are getting an injury discount with Godwin. I'm not drafting Godwin expecting the same exact season that we had last year, where he was the wide receiver 2 in fantasy points per game before he goes down. You go through and look at his year from last season, 22, 24, 17, 12.5, 11.5, and then 35.5 fantasy points. And then obviously the injury against the Baltimore Ravens in week 7. You look at the historical comps for Chris Godwin, who did this at age 28. The other wide receivers that were comparable, Tyreek Hill, Antonio Brown, Marvin Harrison, Stephon Diggs, Keenan Allen, DeAndre Hopkins, Anquan Bolden, AJ Green, Adam Thielen, and Chris Godwin. The absolute worst season that we had the following year at age 29 was going to be Adam Thielen, who averaged 12.5 fantasy points per contest, but every other wide receiver was over 14. So we take Godwin, yes, taking on a lot of injury risk, but taking on a wide receiver that has an incredible ceiling and at the same time could potentially give us those spike weeks and weeks 15, 16, 17 that could lead us to winning $200,000, which obviously is the hope and the dream. Now, going over to receiver that won a lot of money for a lot of people on Underdog last year, we're looking at Ricky Pearsall. The reason that he won a lot of money for people on Underdog is the man dropped 28.5 points in the final championship round in week 17. And y'all know I actually was drafting him a ton last season. Sadly, my Best Ball Mania team that made it to the finals did not have Pearsall on it. So your boy was crap out of luck. But if we're looking at Ricky Pearsall, the last 2 weeks, he really broke out. He was averaging over 100 receiving yards per game. You get 2 receiving touchdowns in those final 2 weeks. If you look at the underlying efficiency for Ricky Pearsall, and yes, Ricky Pearsall played a very limited role. Obviously, we're all going to remember the dude got shot going into his rookie season. But from an efficiency perspective, the man was at 1.94 yards per route run, which is actually a very incredible mark as a rookie. I mean, much, much better than what you have with some of these other guys, such as like Rome Odunze. And we go into this next year, and what I would say is Juwan Jennings, we've seen a large sample of mediocre play, and we've seen one good season, particularly highlighted by like 2 or 3 good weeks. With Brandon Ayuk, you have him injured coming into the season. He may not be ready to go immediately. Pearsall has the round 1 NFL draft capital. We get the flash at the very end of the season going into year 2 fully healthy. Obviously, if we're going to look at the historical comps for his closest comparable, like age 23 seasons, they're not going to be great. We have like Reggie Wayne, Terrence Williams, Alan Lazard, KJ Osborne, Tyler Lockett, Gabe Davis, Sammy Parker, Deontay Hardy, and like Leonard Hankerson. But I don't necessarily know if you can just gauge his rookie season based off the numbers and numbers alone, considering the context. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't think about when they are drafting their fantasy football teams is the chemistry that is going to be there in the locker room. And I just drafted somebody that's gotten shot in the past, that has that experience, and I want him to have a buddy where they can talk about something, where they feel familiar. I'm going to put their lockers right next to each other. They're my back-to-back picks. So we decided to follow this up with Brian Robinson as our third running back. At this point, we've already caught up. We've already drafted 4 wide receivers in the first 7 rounds. So I feel comfortable enough taking another running back that projects to be a starter in a good offense. With Brian Robinson, gets injured last season. A lot of these games are just thrown off where it's very difficult to evaluate him by the numbers. The numbers scream Brian Robinson's probably not going to be a great option this next season. Like the median range of outcomes, like 9.5 fantasy points. I'm just banking on the fact that the Commanders haven't brought anybody in. They could have in the NFL draft. They decided not to. And it's going to be a good offense where he has projectable volume. And we're taking him right before receivers like Michael Pittman, Jaden Higgins, and Trey Harris. I think it's a fine price. Now going over to our next player, we're going to be looking at Josh Downs. Downs does see a significant step forward from year 1 to year 2, where you actually get a jump up from the wide receiver 48 to the wide receiver 30, as well as a jump up with his efficiency from 1.59 yards per route run up to 2.21, and a jump up with his target share from 17.9% up to 25.5%. Now, of course, I completely agree with you. The passing offense is going to be absolutely disgusting in Indianapolis, but similar to what we were talking about with Chris Godwin, I think it's almost maybe priced in here with the Indianapolis Colts wide receivers, because I would make the argument that Josh Downs is the wide receiver 1 in Indy at this point. I have Josh Downs ranked about wide receiver 50 in my rankings, and we're getting Josh Downs after wide receiver 50. Like, again, I think Josh Downs is the number 1 option in his offense, and Luther Burden went an entire round ahead of him. Emeka Egbuka went an entire round ahead of him. And while, yes, those are going to be much better offenses with much better quarterback play with a combination of Caleb Williams and Baker Mayfield, both wide receivers there are at best the third options in their respective offenses. So I'm taking Josh Downs, just getting another wide receiver with projectable volume. Honestly, if you're drafting Downs, you probably hope Daniel Jones is going to be the starting quarterback. I'm going over to our next pick. We're going to take Brock Purdy. Now, in your regular fantasy football league, if you took Jaylen Hurts, you're calling it a day. Yeah, you're not drafting another guy. You'll pick up a quarterback on the bye week. But Underdog, obviously, going to be very different. Best ball. So your best starting lineup is going to be submitted for you at the end of every single week. And at the same time, there is no waiver wire. So you're going to have to draft 2 quarterbacks. And Brock Purdy here, I do think gives us reasonable access to spike weeks. We go back and look at him last season. The man averaged 17.5 fantasy points per game. I actually streamed him some weeks in the Flock League. He was the quarterback 10 from a points per game perspective. And if we go through and if we look at what you got from a supporting cast perspective, I know we just did this with the quarterback rankings, but Brandon Ayuk out for the season, Christian McCaffrey out for the season, Ricky Pearsall was shot, Deebo Samuel was fat. So Brock Purdy was left with nobody. He had to make it work with Juwan Jennings. He had to make it work with George Kittle. But going into this next season, we have Ricky Pearsall healthy, hopefully more than 7 games from Brandon Ayuk. We have George Kittle. We have CMC healthy. Maybe Juwan Jennings turns out to be decent as well. So the supporting cast looks a hell of a lot better for Brock Purdy going into this next season than it did last year. We have Ricky Pearsall, so we get that correlation with this team as our second quarterback as well. So absolutely love it. But y'all notice we're through the first 10 rounds. We don't have a tight end yet. So this is, in my mind, the best range to be taking your tight end in underdog drafts. And I've been thinking about this a lot from my regular redraft perspective, because obviously I'm doing a lot of these underdog drafts with it in the back of my mind that I need to be practicing for the Flock League as well. And I think that there's a range of tight ends at this point that are like all high-end tight end 2s that I feel completely fine with, that may end up going undrafted, may end up being waiver wire options in your redraft league. Guys like Jake Ferguson, Dalton Kincaid, Dallas Goedert, Tucker Kraft, David Njoku, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like one of those guys may be on the waiver wire you can pick up for free. Now here, because it's best ball, you're going to have to draft them, right? So I decided to pull the trigger on David Njoku. With Njoku this past season, he was the tight end 4 from a points per game perspective. Now, yes, they add in Fannin, But realistically, I'm not necessarily expecting that to be too much of a hurdle for David Njoku, who has proven to be a phenomenal tight end 3 straight seasons where he's been a top 10 tight end from a points per game perspective. He averaged 8.8 targets this past year, and they don't really bring in much wide receiver competition. You potentially have Flacco providing a ton of passing volume. Now, I've been thinking recently, trying to figure out who this year's Chase Brown could be. So if we're looking at this year's Chase Brown, we have to compare him to a veteran running back that's currently ahead of him that's probably going to start off the year as the main guy. Where if that veteran running back goes down, it's a running back prospect that we liked stepping into a starting job, preferably in a good NFL offense that's in his second season and maybe didn't get a shot as a rookie. In my mind, if we are trying to figure out who that may be, it sounds a lot like Trey Benson. I have Trey Benson currently ranked as my RB42. Obviously, I would never expect Trey Benson to be usable when James Conner is healthy, the same way that you weren't really starting Chase Brown until Zach Moss went out of the picture. While we didn't get a ton of opportunities for Benson, like he only averaged about 5 carries per game, when he was on the field, we did see flashes. We did see glimpses of him looking pretty good. He averaged 10 yards per target, so some efficiency as a receiver. At the same time, he averaged 4.6 yards per route run, and he had a 26% juke rate. I liked him as a prospect coming out as well. He's only going to be 23 years old. Ray Davis was our next selection, just taking another running back that is probably the RB2 in a good offense, where if you were to get an injury to James Cook, maybe Ray Davis could be the next Chase Brown. Obviously, I'm having a hard time saying that with a straight face because full transparency, Ray Davis is not nearly as good of a prospect as Chase Brown was. And at the same time, James Cook's a hell of a lot better than what Zach Moss was. And what's really funny with Ray Davis here is while he does flash in that singular week that he gets to be a starter in Buffalo last season, he was a rookie last year, and this season he's going to be 26 years old. Like, people were talking about RJ Harvey being old in this rookie draft, but I mean, Ray Davis took that to the next level. Leggett, another year 2 player. Leggett was an absolute bum as a rookie. He was a round 1 NFL draft pick, 23-year-old rookie. You expect this guy to be pro ready. He comes in 1.22 yards per route run, 17% team target share. Now they add Tet McMillan into the mix, so it's very difficult to say that Leggett's good. It's very difficult to get excited about him. But you look at the wide receivers he's getting drafted around, back-to-back with 35-year-old Adam Thielen, 2 picks before Michael Wilson, 3 picks before Pat Bryant. I don't necessarily think any of these players are super special. And then going through these last 4 picks, this is the range of the draft that if you were drafting on ESPN, if you're drafting on Yahoo, you never even have to consider anybody here. You've stopped your draft a while ago. You took your kicker, you took your defense, you logged out. But again, because Underdog's best ball, there's no waiver wire. You have to keep on taking guys. You have to make sure that you have enough depth. So at tight ends, I think that we could get some usable weeks from both Pat Frymuth and Cade Otton. Looking at Frymuth, very consistent, been a high-end tight end 2 for pretty much every season outside of 2023 from a points per game perspective, 1.71 yards per route run. And at the same time, you have no Pickens. They replace him with DK Metcalf, but you have no Deontay Johnson. So there are a lot of targets up for grabs in Pittsburgh. Looking at Cade Otton, he plays a ton. Like, I drafted him a bunch last year, even though we know he's bad, because in 2023, he played 96% of the snaps for Tampa. This past season, he was at 93%. And you actually did see his target share jump from 12.2% up to 19%, which should be very encouraging. But you look at the context of it, it's like, okay, well, Mike Evans was injured at a point. Chris Godwin missed the majority of the season. So they kind of were forced to use Cade Otton. And he still wasn't super efficient. He averaged 1.41 yards per route run. So Cade Otton's bad, but they use him a lot. And he probably is going to be much worse this next season than he was last year. I'm ranked as like a low-end tight end 2, high-end tight end 3. And he finishes the tight end 12 last year from a points per game perspective. But you're going to have added on competition with Godwin and Evans hopefully being healthy, as well as the fact that Igbuka comes in who can take targets as a round 1 great wide receiver prospect. Now, our last 2 picks, absolute dart throws. We took Roman Wilson as a bum wide receiver that's probably not going to do anything but help. There are a lot of routes and there are a lot of targets available in Pittsburgh. We'll probably need Rodgers to sign if Roman Wilson ever does anything for us. And then we took Amari Cooper. Amari didn't have as bad of a season last year as I remembered. Like, looking at Amari Cooper, this is somebody that the range of outcomes the following year probably has him around 7, 8, 9 points per game if he does sign somewhere, but hopefully he signs with a good offense and we can end up getting a respectable spike week or two. But overall, very proud of this team. I am very thankful that y'all been drafting with me in the live streams every night. So we've been able to do a ton of $3, $5 practice drafts. Obviously, I'm going to keep streaming those $3, those $5 practice drafts over and over and over again. That way, when I step into the $500 streets, we are ready. That way, when I go to draft in the Flock League, I am ready. But of course, if you wanted to draft with us or you wanted to get in some practice drafts yourself on Underdog, you can find that link in the description, in the comment section. If you use code FLOCK, you will get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you'll get my 2025 fantasy football rankings and draft guide cheat sheets for free. And keep in mind, Underdog's going to be best ball. So there's no time commitment at all during the season. You're not submitting your starting lineup weekly. You're not making plays on the waiver wire. That's why this draft went so damn deep. That's why we drafted multiple quarterbacks, why we drafted multiple tight ends, and how hopefully this team's walking away with $200,000 at the end of the year. But these are the states that you can draft your Underdog teams in. Thank you. Really appreciate you. And really hope we get to see you out with the live stream and draft with you later tonight.